Hello book lovers, and welcome to The Beauty of Books, a series dedicated to books, you guessed it. Now, a little history about this series. I'm a member of a group on Facebook. It's an illustration group, and in that group I've posted some pictures of illustrations from some of my books, and the posts were quite well received. So I got the idea, why don't I do a live presentation of some of my books from my collection. Now, the books in my collection have been left to me by my father, my mother, and my brother, and the rest of these books I've acquired on my own. I'm quite a book lover, and I'm also a writer. I love to read, I love to write. So that's where the idea for this series came from. Now, let's see. These books, a lot of them are over 20 years old. Some are 50 years old, some are over 100 years old. Most of these books were printed in the 1960s, 1950s, 1940s, and some of them were printed back in the 1800s. I also have boxes of vintage comic books that I will show later in the series also. But now in this premiere episode, the very first episode of this series, I would like to show this book right here. This is a new Polish grammar. Now, you're thinking to yourself, why would I want to look at a grammar textbook? Well, there are several reasons. It's a very old book. It was printed in the 1950s. It has illustrations, and it was printed 1950, so it was soon after World War II. So that makes this book significant because some of the illustrations will show how Poland looked soon after World War II. And I'll show you a little bit about the Polish language and how it's similar to the English language and also the Latin language. Another important, significant thing about this book is that it belonged to my mother, and today is my mother's birthday, March 12th. She was born on March 12th, 1932. Today is March 12th, 2018. She would have been 86 today. And my mom was pure Polish, and she didn't speak a whole lot of Polish, but her parents spoke fluent Polish. So I'd like to show you this book in this episode of The Beauty of Books. So now I'm going to turn it over to Hans. Hans is going to show this book for us. Are you ready, Hans? Okay, there's our book. A New Polish Grammar. Thank you, Hans. And by J.E. Bolanowski. A New Polish Grammar. And the pages are kind of thick, as you can see. Old books are kind of like this. The pages are kind of rough and thick. And it's held up pretty good through all these years. Okay, Hans, what are you going to show us now? There's the inside. And pages are kind of brittle. Wow. About legacy. My mom is really proud of her Polish heritage. So you can see the cover is kind of falling apart. But all in all, this book is held up pretty well. The pages, like I said, are brittle. They're kind of dry over the years. They get like that. If you bend it really hard, it'll probably snap in half and crack. So you have to be careful with old books, obviously. So, okay, here we go. A New Polish Grammar. Oh yeah, you can smell the book. Book lovers love to smell the pages. They love to feel the pages. I can smell my mom when I open this book. It brings back memories of my mom. I think that's why people like books so much, and books will never go away. So New Polish Grammar, this is the 5th edition by J.E. Bolanowski, Vice Principal, Walker Junior High School in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There's Aladdin's lamp. I don't know why that's there. Polonia Publishing Company, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 1950. If you remember the American television show Happy Days, it was set in 1950s. Yeah, Happy Days, yeah. I like to think that Richie Cunningham or Joni could have used this textbook. Or even the Fonz, maybe. Yeah, the Fonz. Happy Days. Anyway, that was a memory of mine. Okay, here we go. Here's the preface. A new Polish grammar is the result of carefully planned and systematic and purposeful experimentation in the classroom. Yeah, it goes on and on. This is interesting stuff, yeah. What are you going to show us, Hans? Oh, problems, yes. Problems encountered in the study of a language rather than with lessons. He uses the word problems instead of lessons in this book. The problem is the most natural core around which to organize the subject matter to be learned. Yes, the world's full of problems, and this book is a problem. No, the word used, the author likes to use lessons instead of, problems instead of lessons. There's the copyright dates: 1938, 1941, 1945, 1950. This book's gone through many revisions and publications. Some were before this book and some were after this book. Oh yeah, as sometimes when the text is difficult to read in old books, you can use this thing called a loop. What you do is you set it on top of the page and you bend over and you look into it, and it makes the text really big. It magnifies it. It's like looking at the text through a microscope. Scholars, proofreaders, historians use this kind of thing. You can use a magnifying glass, but it helps, but the problem is you can see, you get a reflection from the light. You can see the lamp above the book there, and you get reflections. You can make little hand shadows. Woof, 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 woof. Yeah, so that's why you don't want to use a magnifying glass. It's probably better to use a loop when trying to read difficult to read old text in old books. So, okay, what's next, Hans? Yeah, illustrations. Yeah, this book has illustrations. What would a book be without illustrations? We like to look at the pictures, don't we? I like to look at pictures. So, okay, here's the list of illustrations. The front piece, that's what we just saw. Dance group, yeah. All the different illustrations in this book. Some are just photographs, and some are actual sketches by an artist. It doesn't say who the artist is. So let's go to an illustration now. This is one of the illustrations by the artist, unknown artist, probably a Polish artist. It shows the typical American family. There's the father reading the newspaper, the mother reading a Good Housekeeping magazine, and there's the son. Notice the son is playing with blocks. Nobody plays with blocks anymore. Remember, this is the 1950s. Wally Cleaver. Yeah, the kid would be playing Xbox nowadays, and everybody would be using a cell phone nowadays instead of reading the newspaper. Remember, this is 1950s. This would be like the Cleaver family, Leave It to Beaver, that era. So how about, let's go to a busy corner in Warsaw. Let's go to that illustration now. There it is. Oh yeah, this is how you pronounce Polish. But a busy corner in Warsaw. This is a busy corner in Warsaw, Poland, back in the 1950s. And notice the Chevrolet sign on top of the building. And no, that's not Photoshop. There really is a Chevrolet factory in Warsaw, Poland. And Warsaw, Poland, yes, that's where it is. And the interesting story about this is, back in World War II, the Polish they built an armored car out of a Chevy truck back in the 1940s. And that's what they used to fight off the German resistance. Pow, pow, pow. And that's what, you can still see the armored car in museums in Poland today, in the 2018 today. Remember, this book was published in 1950, soon after World War II ended. And here's another thing about Polish history. The cemetery of the defenders of Lwów. It's not that word Lwów isn't even in use anymore. It's spelled differently. Among them, the children, having not yet reached their teens, killed in their efforts to defend their country from the invasion by the Ukrainians in the fateful November of 1918. That was the end of World War I. It's very sad that children would have to defend their country, but Polish has always been a war-torn country. It's right in the middle, right in the center of Europe, and it's always in the center, gets caught up in the middle of all these wars between the Germans and the Russians. But anyway, this guy Paderewski is an interesting fellow, and he played a role in this actually. Ignace Jan Paderewski, a statesman. He endeared himself to the Poles by displaying his genius for diplomacy in their behalf at Versailles. Remember, at the end of World War I, you remember Woodrow Wilson established his 14 points? Well, this guy right here, Paderewski, he was the Prime Minister of Poland during that time period. And he helped establish Polish freedom. He was also a pianist. Yes, he played the piano. And after World War I, he gave up politics and went back to playing the piano. And an interesting thing, he was the first solo performer to give a solo recital at Carnegie Hall in New York City. Now, Tchaikovsky, of course, was the first performance, but this guy was the first solo performer at Carnegie Hall. Tchaikovsky gave the first performance. He conducted the orchestra, but Paderewski was the first to give a solo performance. Here's another famous Polish person. You recognize this guy? No, he wasn't Polish. That's George Washington. Congratulates Kosciuszko. George Washington extends his thanks to Thaddeus Kosciuszko. That's Thaddeus Kosciuszko for his help rendered to the American colonists in the war for their independence, the American Revolutionary War back in the 1700s. Now this guy, Kosciuszko, he fought in the Polish-Russian War, and he also fought for the Americans in the American Revolutionary War back in 1798. And he was also a friend of Thomas Jefferson. Interesting people in Poland. Okay, Hans, what are you going to show us now? Shall we study grammar? A little bit about Polish grammar? Here we go. The third declension. Interesting thing, see, problem 17, notice he doesn't use the word lesson, he uses the word problem. The third declension. The nouns which belong to the third declension are as follows. Feminine nouns that end in A or I. Now, the interesting thing about the Slavic language is it's very similar to the Latin language, and it's also very different. And I'll show you why. Here's my first year Latin book. Now, in Latin, this is the first declension. Nouns whose stems ends in a belong to the first declension. Remember, in Polish, it's the third declension. I don't know, I just thought that was interesting. The similarities and the differences between the Latin language and the Polish language. So, the Polish language is broken down into cases, nominative, genitive, accusative. And here's another interesting fact about the Polish grammar. Here's the word historia. It means history. What a surprise. Historia. Now, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, vocative, instrumental, and locative cases. Instrumental and locative cases in Polish. Now, in is an instrumental and locative case for the word Historia. Now, in Latin, remember Polish is a derivative, sort of a derivative of the Latin. In Latin you have nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and the ablative case, which ends in A. And the ablative case is actually the beginning of where the instrumental case came from. He comes, remember, it takes place, expresses the instrument by which, or the circumstances under which an action takes place. So in Latin we have the ablative case, and in the later Slavic languages we have the instrumental and the locative case that are very similar to the ablative case in Latin. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting. I wanted to share that with you too. So, okay, Hans, what are you going to show us now? More about Polish grammar. Okay. Ah, yes, the word brat means brother in Polish. Think of your brother as a brat. Now, in Latin, the word for brother is frater. Think of fraternity. Okay, the word for God in Polish, Bozi, gods of God, Boz Narodzena, God, Christmas. Think of Navidad, nativity, gods of God. Bog is the Polish word for God, and also in other Slavic languages such as Bulgarian and Russian, the word for God is also Bog. But here's another difference between the Slavic language and the Latin language. In Latin, the word for God is Deus. Deus. Thank you, Hans. And the feminine goddess is Dea. Think of deity, the word deity in English. So there you go, there's the difference. The similarities and the differences between the Polish language and the Latin language. Ipska scientia potestas est. Knowledge itself is power. And we're getting some knowledge today. I'm giving you some power today by giving you knowledge about the Polish language. So there we go. Thank you, Hans. So what's next? Okay, how about what are you going to show us, Hans? Flip through the book, the dative case, and illustrations. Here we go. Would you like to would you like to hear a Polish poem? Sure you would. Zad I Baba. Zad I Baba. And no, we're not talking about the ticker for the Chinese company Alibaba. Baba means old woman in Polish. So Zad I Baba is the old man and the old woman. This is an old Polish poem, sometimes sung as a ballad also. And this was written a long time ago in the 1850s, 100 years before this book was published, before this Polish grammar book was published, 100 years before this book was published. So it's a pretty old poem. Just zoom in a little bit. I think that's a little bit too close, Hans. Zoom out a little bit, please. Yeah, that's better. A little bit more. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Thank you, Hans. Okay, there we go. Zad I Baba. I'm trying to pronounce it. Biol Zubi Zad I Baba. Barza Starzi Oboya. Ona Kazlaga Zaba. On Segosi Wedwoya. That's in Polish. Now there once was an old woman and an old man and an old woman. They lived by themselves. They were both very old. She was coughing and weak. He was shrunken in two. They had a little shack, as old as they were. The shack was as old as they were. The shack had one window and one entrance. Now they were very happy. and calm like in the clouds in heaven. Maybe I think of clouds. It's not surprising because they were used to each other. Only they were sad. They were sad that they had to die. Not like it once was back in the day. Their long lives would be divided, separated. And they prayed sincerely to God's command. See, bosom is a variation of bog, which is the word for God. I just think that's interesting. When death, that's the word for death. Death. When death takes them, she will take them together. Together, he says, it cannot be. Someone will have to be taken first. It won't be you, you poor thing. It won't be you. I will die first, cried the old woman. I'm older than you. Every moment I'm more weak. You'll cry at my funeral. I am ahead. I'll go first, my love. I cough constantly and I'm cold. It will cover any morning. That means one morning I won't wake up. And they go on to say, me first. Me first. Me first, honey. Everyone says, me first, honey. I'm telling you, that's enough. Me first. You will go first. You will cry. And not you. And not you? Why? And they go on, they argue on and on like this. How they started to argue, it would be taken from this place. They wanted to leave the hut. Until, on the door, there was a knock. Book, 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 knock. Very slow knock. Book, book, book. Who's there? Who's there? They said. Open, please. Be obedient. I am death. I am death. Death I bring to you. She says the voice from outside. And the guy says, go, woman. Open the door. She says, you go alone. I'm weak. I will go to bed now. Answered the old woman. Fie! Death! On the porch, death! On the porch stands. Death is standing on the porch. You open the door. The woman hid quietly. The woman hid behind the burning stove, the hiding place he searched. The old man pushed himself under the bench, pushed the bench and hid under it. And death, death, was still knocking at the standing and knocking at the door. And she would stand there for 200 years. Where she stood there 200 years, she would stand there constantly at the door, but bored. But boredom took her. After standing so long, boredom finally overtook her, and down the chimney she went. Komnium chimney. She went down the chimney and took them. So, there you go. This poem is by Józef Ignacy Poskrowski. He was a Polish writer, publisher, historian, journalist, scholar, and painter, and the author of this poem. He produced 200 novels and 150 novellas, short stories, and art reviews. He was born in July 28, 1812 in Warsaw, Poland, and died in March 19, 1887 in Geneva, Switzerland. So there you go, a new Polish grammar. Thank you, Hans. That wasn't too painful now, was it? I thought it was quite interesting. Thank you for watching this episode of The Beauty of Books, and I hope you'll come back next time.